Good evening, and welcome to The Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from FEMA Region 5, deep in the bowels of the United Police State of Amnesia. Today is December 18th, 2015, and we are approaching the holiday season, the culmination of the high point of the holiday season, New Year's. And after that, we're going to be launching into a new year, 2016, in which I'm sure a lot of big events are scheduled to happen. And there may be even some unscheduled big events. But one thing we can be guaranteed of is that there will be a scheduled big terrorist attack, probably on the United States. And that will almost certainly put at least one major city into lockdown mode, which means no one can leave their house. It'll be shelter in place, and there'll be billions of dollars in lost wages and lost productivity. I mean, just a couple of days ago, we saw all of Los Angeles lose a day of school because somebody emailed a threat saying that they were going to shoot up a school, and they had bombs and they had guns and they had jihadists all ready to go. And they bought it in Los Angeles, and they didn't buy it in New York City because they're not so afraid in New York City at the moment as they are in Los Angeles, because they just had another terrorist attack in California, in San Bernardino, which is a very poor city, second poorest city in the nation, but with a very low rate for cop turnout. It takes 20 minutes for cops to arrive in San Bernardino. Fortunately, they were having a drill really close by, so they were all suited up and ready to go. And they caught the perpetrators who did not fit the descriptions at all of the eyewitnesses, who said the shooters were three men, white men with athletic build, in military fatigues, loaded down with big guns and magazines, and they opened up the door of the center where the people were gathered and just started shooting through the door. And then they ran off and got in a big black SUV and drove off. And then we are told that a fairly small guy, a colleague of the people who were shot up, the code inspectors, environmental inspectors, they were responsible. But he was Muslim, and his wife was Muslim, a little tiny woman, under 100 pounds, from Afghanistan. A lot of people are feeling that these were just patsies, and of course they're dead now, so no one will ever know that they didn't do it. They'll never be able to speak for themselves. And now they're going after their neighbor, who they claim was involved just because he sold them the guns and was talking about terrorist attacks or perpetrating a terrorist attack. And I don't know what that's all about. But usually those very early reports are the most accurate, because the people who are reporting are actually reporting on what they saw. They have not been intimidated. They're not actors. They were there, and they just happened to see it, and they were not part of the big story, the big show that's being put on. Yeah, it looks like people maybe really were killed in this particular terrorist attack. I think in a lot of them they really weren't. But this is all part of an even bigger show that's an ongoing show that's actually called Reality. They're calling it Reality, and they're getting better and better at controlling reality and creating a realistic show with incredibly realistic special effects that is indistinguishable unless you really study it and it starts to make sense from reality. Now, you could say that it was pretty obvious that the people in Los Angeles should not have canceled school because they had to, it pretty much had to have been a hoax. Why would the perpetrators of a terrorist attack inform you that they were going to attack you before they attacked you? Does that make sense? You know, we're going to attack you. Well, hello, it might have been some high school kids who did it. You know, they want to get out of school. And they had no idea maybe that all the schools in Los Angeles would be shut down. According to what I heard, the IP address was in Germany, was in Frankfurt. Well, my understanding is that that can be faked. You can fake you can put in a false IP, it somehow works. Who knows what's going on here? But another big event that's happening right now is that the new Star Wars movie is coming out, and it's, I haven't seen it. I haven't had a chance to see it. I'll probably see it pretty soon. But, you know, Star Wars, whether you like it or not, has had a huge effect on popular culture, and we have to at least look at it. And Alex Jones, our old friend Alex Jones, the creme de la creme of conspiracy theorists, does a pretty good job of analyzing the whole series, and he's not looking at the Ewoks or Jar Jar Binks or any of the things that people don't like. He's just looking at the serious level, the plot level that's very serious about how governments that are republics get turned into empires, dictatorial, totalitarian, ruthless, tyrannical empires. And the new Star Wars apparently takes it further, and somebody is doing their homework in these stories. And of course, George Lucas is behind the whole thing. And George Lucas, from the beginning, wanted to make a statement, an underlying thematic statement about the loss of liberty and the erosion of civil rights that he was seeing when he was young, because this franchise started in, I believe, 1978. It's a long time. That's almost 40 years. And so there is, as much as you might think of it as goofy, childish fun and entertainment, there is a very, very serious theme also, and that's probably what contributes to the series' longevity, that it seems to be relevant, and you can take the series in the direction that the country or the world seems to be going. And a lot of it is the playbook that is repeated over and over throughout history. And Alex Jones mentions this, and a lot of other people have talked about this, that books have been written about this. You look at history, you can see how people manipulate to get their way and become a dictator. So without more ado, let's roll the tape. It's pretty entertaining, about 5 minutes long.
Well, the long-anticipated Star Wars movie is finally in theaters. And you know, without question, the Star Wars movies have had a huge impact on popular culture. And George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, says that deep down, everyone knows that the greatest threat to liberty isn't the average criminal on the street, but the monolithic, all-powerful state, the New World Order. The human desire to resist tyranny is one of the strongest drives we have. George Lucas did a really good job of portraying that in his movies. For example, Star Wars Episode 3, The Revenge of the Sith, well, it's about as sci-fi as you can get, but it mirrors reality, and it details the psychology of government-sponsored terrorism as a tool of empire.
Emperor Palpatine was a little-known senator from Naboo, small planet. He finances terrorists to attack the planet. And then he plays victim and says that the pacifist republic isn't doing enough to help him with the terrorist invasion, the Trade Federation invasion, who even speak in Chinese accents. It's all geopolitical. He then goes and complains and catapults himself in the crisis into the role of chancellor. Because, you know, he was the victim, but now he demanded something be done. He'd been a pacifist previously. Now he's chancellor. Episode 2 launches terror attacks all over the galaxy with groups he's secretly financing through his backers in the Trade Federation. He turns around and double crosses in the end. So basically, in the end, they knock out all of the people that backed him, which always happens. Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Maoist China, learn from history. Then in episode, so he uses that to build up the power of the empire in episode 2. And now he's got this big Imperial army, but it's not Imperial yet. But it's the stormtroopers, the outfits, the weapon systems to counter this outside threat run by Count Dooku, the Osama bin Laden guy that actually works for him, and they meet in secret. Now, in episode 3, he launches an attack on the Imperial capital himself. He launches an attack on New York. And then he gets captured, and then he sets up Count Dooku to get killed, and then he seduces to the dark side Anakin Skywalker to make him Darth Vader. And in the end, he then sets up, after he has the police state in place, he sets up the Jedi and says they're terrorists and has the anti-terror forces go in and wipe them out. And then he says he's launching a global intergalactic war to bring peace. Now, the media could not understand, wait, and they actually wrote articles, Emperor Palpatine's attacking himself, it makes no sense. Adults cannot understand children-level ideas, okay? Child-level ideas. Child-level.
Now, Star Wars The Force Awakens is the new film now in theaters, this time produced by Disney and directed by J.J. Abrams. And it continues the cinematic saga of an interplanetary civilization's struggles with galactic war and tyranny. The plot of the new Star Wars movie frighteningly resembles modern-day America, as global warfare driven by a planetary empire thrusts the world into a militarized police state. Once again, science fiction mirrors reality. Infowars.com.
The Force is strong with you. A powerful Sith you will become. Henceforth, you shall be known as Darth Vader.
The globalists have controlled the mainstream media for a long time, but now they're expanding and making the weaponization even more vicious and deceptive. All the major networks are state-run.
We are partnering this year with the NFL.
The NFL has become a political weapon against the Second Amendment and pushes Obamacare. MSNBC tells us that our children belong to the state.
We have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities.
It is more important than ever to realize that we are not the alternative media. We are the true media. The establishment dinosaur press is dying.
We are in an information war, and we are losing that war.
Yeah, okay, so that's pretty fun, I think. Just looking at those clips, I think that a lot of what happens in the Star Wars is just there's so much going on, and a lot of humor is thrown in most of these movies that you miss. You're just watching this incredible array of special effects just flashing by, and maybe you're being critical of some of the acting, which is maybe just a little bit marginal. But I think that over time, these films will probably gain in stature, and they will be taken a little more seriously and looked at and analyzed more fully and looked at from a little more mature standpoint, because a lot of the Star Wars films are really made for children or young adults or 12-year-olds. I think maybe that's not a bad idea. You know, get them young, get them thinking about things, and you know, get them aware that some of these politicians really do try to pull stunts like this and take over. We've seen it over and over happen in real life. We had an attempt by Prescott Bush and other industrialists and very wealthy men back in the 1930s. These guys, Prescott Bush was the grandfather of George W. Bush, and of course the grandfather of Jeb Bush, and he was a staunch Nazi supporter, believed in Hitler, as many people, wealthy people particularly, did in the 1920s or the 1930s, and even into the 40s. And they supported the Nazi war machine in the United States. I.G. Farben, Ford, and other big manufacturers provided them with material, war material, to run the Nazi death camps, and those parts of the vehicles that were used by the Nazis, provided by American companies or international companies. And of course the banks, the international banks, certainly the Nazis had access to the banks to get the funds to get things going, and the banks really were helpful for both sides, as they always are in these wars. And this is even happening right now. I mean, there was just a statement today that was made, well, it was a conversation on NPR that I heard today, that there was going to be an effort to keep ISIS from getting the funds through the international banks that they have been borrowing, apparently, to fund their operations. And you know, they just talk about this very casually. Oh yeah, we've got to stop them from, you know, getting the funds, you know, shut off their funds. But wait a minute. So ISIS, which has been committing terrorist acts around the world and in the United States, supposedly, and has been committing genocide against other Muslims and Christians and other groups that are marginalized, fringe groups that, you know, there are little tiny sects of Muslims who, and these mainstream, very conservative Muslims, at least they call themselves conservative Muslims, actually do not like them and don't think they're Muslim, and so they go after them. You mean to tell me that ISIS has all along had access to funds from banks? But yes, this is actually the case. And unless you really think about that, you won't realize that this is evidence of the New World Order right there. Very clear, presented on mainstream media, NPR News, casually spoken, talked about in a conversation between journalists about everyday events that are happening, you know, as we speak. So yeah, the banks are funding ISIS. Why? Because there's money to be made from ISIS as well as the other sides in the conflict. And of course you think, have these banks, I mean, these banks are human beings, they're run by human beings, don't they have any compassion for the suffering that they're causing around the world by funding both sides? I mean, it would be bad enough to just fund one side and choose one side over another side, but no, they make, I'm pretty sure that they make it a policy that they fund anybody that they feel has the collateral to cover the loan. And whether that would be collateral that they gain through conquest and bloodshed and genocide, it's just collateral to them. It's just something to back up their loan and proof that they can pay the loan back. And I imagine that the banks are thinking, well, you know, how can we refuse to loan money to certain people? That would be unfair. And not only that, but today's terrorist is tomorrow's legitimate government. And that would hurt our standing, our status, our prestige as a bank to make those kind of judgments. So we just stay out of the political world altogether. But you see how that would promulgate a callous attitude towards other members of the human race who are not of your class, those who are not amazingly, incredibly wealthy and aristocratic elite, the super rich, the bankers, the CEOs, and so on. And this is pointing unconsciously. I mean, this reporter, this journalist, had no idea of what she was doing, what she was inadvertently revealing. But actually, if you think about it, they talk about that all the time, oftentimes. That, yeah, they have access to loans from the big banks, the international banks. And that doesn't, I'm sorry, just because you're an international bank doesn't allow you, doesn't give you the right to fund both sides of a conflict. At least in my view, there's no, I mean, you could say, well, but somebody's got to, have access to international funds. I mean, banks are there so that we can run the economy, the world economy, the global economy, for peaceful purposes as well as for war. And where do you draw the line? Where do you decide? How can they decide who is good and who is bad? That's another issue. That's a difficult issue. That's really a tough one. It's really a tough one. But it just seems like maybe banks should be tied to individual countries. Let the ISIS people start their own bank, if they want to have access to funds, and see where that gets them. I don't know. But the difficulty and the complexity of this world is, sometimes almost beyond comprehension, and people just throw up their hands and just say, I give up, and, I'm just going to watch sports, or I'm just going to, bury my head in the sand and, just live my life and take care of my family and just forget about the whole thing, try to forget about the whole thing. That is one option. I think that deliberately avoiding events, world events, can be dangerous because you can fall into a trap that you didn't know about, that you would have known about if you had been following world events and looking at trends forecasters and so on, and trying to get a handle on what is happening and what is coming down the road, or what might happen, or what very likely could happen, or what is expected to happen, what the wisdom, the mainstream media is saying, as opposed to those who are on the outside looking in, and they have no agenda, they have no axe to grind, they are beholden to no one except their viewers or their readers, and they therefore perhaps have a more unbiased view about events and the interpretation of events. So we have to, as much as it may be unpleasant oftentimes, to look into, to keep looking into events, we're almost beholden, we're almost required, it's almost a duty to do that. At some point, I wish that I could just pull away from it. I'm getting up in years, and I sometimes feel that I just don't want to have any part of it. It makes me sick, sometimes almost physically ill, to find out what goes on in this world. and also the difficulty of trying to figure out whether the information that I'm receiving is actually accurate. It's and more and more we're getting what could be just disinformation, propaganda, and they're getting so good at creating it that it's difficult. So yeah, I mean, the events just keep unrolling in front of us. For someone who is maybe younger and is trying to find their way in the world, I think it's important to make those kind of decisions. And one of the major decisions that a young man or now a young woman might consider is whether or not they're going to be joining the military. Now, they've just allowed women to not only join the military, they've been allowed to do that for a while, but now they're going to be able to participate in combat. In combat. And I just saw a picture in the New York Times or somewhere of some women, you know, they were all holding these huge guns and looking very pleased with themselves in their uniforms. And I'm thinking, you know, why? Why would any woman want to do that? That has not been the role of women. Women have been historically out of, you know, they are more the victims of war than the participants, unless they're absolutely forced into it. But to volunteer, and you know, women have served with distinction in the past, but usually they're forced to do it. We have the example of Molly Pitcher, who famously in the American Revolution loaded the cannon after her husband got killed and could no longer, or wounded, and could no longer load the cannon, and she became famous because of that. But you could say, well, you know, the American Revolution, that was pretty necessary. They're fighting against you talk about an empire. The British Empire at that time was just running over people and exploiting them and robbing people around the world. Very powerful, could be very brutal, and well, that's history. But yeah, women in the military, you know, they're certainly, they have the, I guess, you know, in this world, you know, they want the right to be able to do that. But I think if people really knew what the military is about and what they're doing, how it works, they might think twice before actually volunteering. When we look at the statistics of the returning, the mental and physical condition of the veterans, when they return from the war, they very often are damaged, they're traumatized, mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and really have a difficult time adjusting to ordinary life because they've gone through a rigorous, essentially a brainwashing training program to make them unfeeling killers, which is what a soldier is trained to do. And anybody who saw Full Metal Jacket, you can get a pretty accurate idea of what a new recruit goes through, and what the kind of program and the intense program that the drill instructor puts the new recruits through in order to break them down, their personality, turn them into a cipher, a non-person, and then rebuild them up again, but with a new personality. And it's a closed-off personality to a large extent, especially in the Marine Corps. They have difficulty accessing their emotions, and this is to allow them to kill without mercy, without hesitation. And you know, this is not good for the human psyche, and women are particularly vulnerable to this. Women, they have they have studies to show that a larger percentage of women get PTSD. They get it more easily and more severe than men. And the percentage of homeless women veterans is really high. It's bad for men, it's worse for women. Same with suicide, alcohol and drug abuse. You can go right down the list and you can see that this is just not good. This is just not good for people. Even people involved in righteous causes, like World War II veterans, had difficulty dealing with what they experienced and the trauma of war, no matter how, so it is how justified that it may be. And we've seen from 9/11 onward that the wars that the United States government and its allies have been participating in and creating, essentially, they do not meet the sniff test for justification once you look into them and you get through that surface layer of false propaganda. It's happening again, over and over and over again. They've had to make all kinds of adjustments with this war in Syria. Now, they're no longer talking about replacing the Assad government, but now they want to just go, okay, we'll just get rid of Assad and his cronies, but we'll keep the rest of the government in place. Well, so you get a regime change light, apparently, because they can't get rid of him. And now, of course, Russia has come in and coming to the aid of its ally, Syria, which it's doing with the blessings of Syria. Syria asked Russia to help. And under the international law, under treaties that were signed, then that is what the states are supposed to do. And those states that invade another country that is against all kinds of international law. And so America is guilty of that as well, the problems that are resulting. And the only reason that the leadership of the United States has not gone to The Hague and been indicted and then tried for war crimes is because who's going to do it? Who's going to get them? Who's going to arrest our leadership? Now, it's true that George W. Bush was going to give a speech in Switzerland, and he had to cancel it because he would have been arrested. And then, for war crimes. And our old friend Henry Kissinger is wanted in several countries for murder, war crimes, genocidal, all kinds of things. The coup in Chile and the people that were killed as a direct result of that coup that Henry Kissinger and the CIA put together in the early 70s, and lots of other things. But who's going to get him? Who's going to do it? No one. No one is going to do it. And they are careful. They do have to be careful where they go. And it's possible that Obama may have to be careful where he goes down the road. It may be a situation in which Hillary Clinton is not going to be able to go to certain countries because she signed on to the invasion of Libya and laughed about the killing of Omar Gaddafi, which you are not supposed to do. You are not supposed to just go after the leadership and then just kill them. They're supposed to be brought to justice. But what I've been seeing in the news is that killing is being called brought to justice. And so if this can be justified, if this can be made legitimate in people's minds, then it's Katie bar the door. They can get away with anything if the public will accept outright cold-blooded murder or execution-style murder without a trial, without a jury, without a judge, nothing, but just on-the-spot execution after the person has surrendered, which is what happened to Gaddafi, then if they can do that to the leadership of a country, a leader, then what can they do to anyone? To anyone, to any soldier, to any citizen. And so this is a very dangerous path and a slippery slope that America and other countries in the West are heading down. And I think people have to be careful about this kind of thing. And all too often, it's all too easy to just say, well, we have to kill these people. We have to get rid of them. They're terrorists. They're threatening us. Well, there's all kinds of problems with that kind of thinking. If you let fear run you, then, well, I have to think of one of the main themes of Star Wars, to get back to Star Wars, when Yoda, says, fear leads to hate, and hate leads to violence, and, wrongdoing and tyranny. Ignorance. I think I was reading somewhere else that there is a quote from another wise, person who thought about this, that it starts with ignorance. Ignorance leads to fear. Fear leads to hate. Hatred leads to violence. And so, again, it goes back to education. If you are ignorant, you need to be educated. And educated in what? Educated in the truth. And people make fun of the truther movement. They're just truthers. This is a new word. I like it better than the old label, which is conspiracy theorist, but at least the truther seems to be a little more accurate. And to me, there's nothing wrong with searching for truth. I think that benefits everyone. And and why not? It may be unpleasant, but it's better than just going through life with your eyes closed. So, we have an issue right now with people losing their civil rights. And this is openly being discussed and talked about as an option to deal with the fear of terrorism. This doesn't even address whether or not these terrorist attacks are really happening as reported that they're happening. And there is all kinds of evidence to show that many of these terrorist attacks probably never happened at all. They were staged. They appeared to happen, and they showed footage on television of what is supposed to be a terrorist attack. But as I've shown you in previous episodes of this show, like the surveillance or the footage from a camera in a cafe in Paris, what we're told is an actual terrorist shooting up the place is pretty obviously a drill with some really shoddy special effects thrown in to make it maybe look a little more real, and it really doesn't. But this is this type of thing that's, if you examine footage and you look closely at it, oftentimes you'll find that this is the case. There's some footage that's out there in the mainstream media. It's been shown hundreds of thousands of times on television of a terrorist during the Charlie Hebdo attack supposedly executing a police officer on the streets of Paris, which actually may or may not be Paris. Might be Paris. Might be somewhere else. It's hard to tell. It's a city. But anyway, yeah, he gets out of the car, goes over, and there's a policeman lying on the ground. He's been wounded. We don't see any blood. He's on the sidewalk. He points the AK-47 at him and pulls the trigger, one shot. And the guy just goes like, you know, he's already lying there and his head just goes down, boom. No movement at all, no shaking. And he pointed it right at his head, supposedly. But the strange thing is, yes, and it goes off, but on the other side of his head, you can see a puff of dust right when he pulls the trigger, and the gun goes off. And so clearly, he did not shoot the police officer, and the police officer was faking it. He really didn't die at all. There's no blood, there's no, I mean, at that range, from a bullet from an AK-47 to the head, that would cause massive skull damage. And blood would be spurting out. There'd be something. And also the fact that he just goes still. And that's what people have learned from watching movies, that that's what happens when you get shot, is that you just immediately, you're just completely still. Your body doesn't shiver and shake and thrash around at all. Someone who's really been shot, it is horrific, and it is an image you will not ever forget. It will haunt you for the rest of your life, oftentimes. An actual shooting. And you know, the Hollywood version is sanitized, mostly. Occasionally, in a movie, you'll see someone actually die in a realistic manner. Haven't seen too many of those. I believe in Full Metal Jacket, they had a few deaths that were realistically depicted of soldiers dying. And, you know, they're shaking and you know, spasming and all this. Or close to death, you know, badly wounded, close to death, 30 seconds to a minute away from death. And it's a horrific thing to see even in seeing an actor simulate that. So, you know, that's just one example. Just one example of videotape that's available for anyone to see. This is not hidden at all. But if you look at it closely, it does not appear to be genuine. And so we have to question whether or not much of what we're seeing is actually happening. There's no question at all that journalists oftentimes get it wrong. Not deliberately, sometimes it's deliberate, but oftentimes they don't know what they're seeing. They don't know how to analyze an image. When they see a videotape that they're given to show and they're rolling it, they're running it, they don't even have time to analyze it. Well, you know, a lot of the actors are really, a lot of the anchors in the big shows, they're more like actors. I mean, they're reading a script, and maybe they go offline a little bit, off script a little bit, but oftentimes they have the script just to read it, and that's what they're doing. They're not true journalists. They're frontmen, they're mouthpieces, they're a pretty face or a handsome face or an authoritative face with a really solid voice that will convince the audience that what they're looking at is the real thing, that what they're saying is true. And in any kind of a society, this is what the controllers will attempt to do. They will they will set themselves up as kind, beneficent father figures, big brother figures, grandfather figures, like in the Hunger Games, like President Snow. He's like the father figure or grandfather figure. He has the perfect look. He has the white hair, the kindly manner, the genteel voice, the inflection, the voice inflection, everything he has down to a T. Donald Sutherland does a great job with him. And yeah, that's another series that just finished up. And it really is a very good series. And it's more serious, strangely, for considering it was written for young adults than you would imagine that it would be. I mean, you have the silly kind of teenage romance, the triangle between Jennifer Lawrence and the two young men. And that sort of reminds you that these are kind of teenagers, who have a crush on somebody, or can't decide, oh, will I go with this boy or will I go with this boy? But underlying that, the themes are so very serious. I just saw the last installment of The Hunger Games, The Mockingjay 2, and it wrapped it up really well, I thought, and made you think. And it was interesting that the president, the new president, the woman, betrays. I mean, she does not follow through with the promise of her efforts, all the efforts that she made, some true motivations. Now, whether she's corrupted by power or she had that intent all along, it's hard to say. But it shows that once you get in a leadership position like that, you are very tempted to use what works in order to keep that control. And it takes a very educated leader and it takes an educated population in order to resist that. And remember, that's what our founding fathers, that's what they were. They were probably the most educated men of their day, people like Thomas Jefferson and even George Washington, and certainly Benjamin Franklin, were like, you had that, they were excellent in so many ways. Ben Franklin being a really good writer, an inventor, an amazing inventor, a diplomat, a person who could explain his position and persuade you that his position was right, and really prove it through argument. As far as that goes, Thomas Jefferson was also an inventor. If you've ever been to Monticello, you see all the inventions and innovations that he installed that are still there for you to see. But these were extraordinary men who weren't perfect, of course, by any means, but they were the best going at the time. And they were able to set up a model of government that was imitated throughout the world. And that's why America is, you could say, is special. But we could be nearing that development, that stage in development, in which first of all, people take their freedoms and their civil rights for granted, and they're not calling them civil rights on the news or in the magazines or anything. They call them civil liberties, maybe, but very rarely do I hear the word civil rights, because that resonates from the 60s, where people fought so hard to get their civil rights. But that's exactly what these are. It's the Bill of Rights that we are losing, and it's civil rights that we are losing. Just as the civil rights were taken away from the black man for such a long time, after they were granted to him after the end of the Civil War, and then they were gradually removed from the black man in America. And then the civil rights were reinstated to the black man through the efforts of many people, including people like Martin Luther King. You know, they fought very hard, and Martin Luther King ultimately died at the hands of the FBI by an assassin's bullet, who was a patsy, for his efforts to keep America a republic, or return America to its Republican roots that it started to have. And we have to remember, of course, that the republic was eroded, began to be eroded right from the start, because there are always men who feel that they're tired of the slow turning of the gears in a democracy, a republic. You don't get things done very fast. You're wrangling, you're compromising, you're struggling, because there are always people who are going to be against you, no matter how forward-thinking your policies are. Somebody is going to be against you, and you cannot get rid of them. You must listen to them, because that is the way you have set the system up. And you have to be an educated person to have that kind of patience and realize that it's all for the best. Because once you take away someone else's ability to speak their mind, no matter how offensive or wrong they are, then eventually you and your views may also be suppressed. And people forget this. This is why some countries in the world, they cannot have a democracy, because they're not willing to put up with the democracy. And in the Star Wars situation, that is one of the main thrusts of the plot of this political progress or thread that runs through the very important in the Star Wars saga. People are impatient with the problems. Now, one of the things that the Star Wars saga points out is that many of the problems are started by the same people who are complaining that the problems aren't being solved fast enough, and want to go toward more power to leadership and toward a dictatorial government in order to solve the problems. Do you see how this manipulates and gets set up? You get set up for the fall, and that's what's happening now. Because it always happens, pretty much. I mean, if you do not have a threat, the government is virtually guaranteed to create a threat. We've seen this in the United States. Why do they have a threat? Why do they need a threat? They need a threat because people will lose interest in having someone govern them if there is no threat, because they will feel, well, what do I need big government for? Let's shrink the government because everything is going fine. What do we need a standing army for? There's no threat. There's no war. We're all friends. We have peace in the world. What do we need to develop these advanced weapon technologies for? And then you have senators, representatives from the various states, in the case of the United States, who have enormous money involved in developing the weapons of war. And you have the Army bases, the naval bases, the shipyards, the Air Force bases. You have the weapons of war manufacturing plants. The United States is the #1 manufacturer of weapons in the world by far. And so as soon as peace happens, peace breaks out, many of these people are freaking out. Their constituents are freaking out. And they do not want to lose their cash flow. They do not want to lose those jobs. They have thousands or millions of people involved in this. They don't want to lose those jobs. And that's their duty, is to represent their constituents. And they see that as their duty, and in a way it is their duty, yes, And they're not seeing the larger picture that, hey, if you're going to have peace, you've got to stop making weapons of war. And instead, what they're doing is they're trying to take away people's handguns and rifles, or limit their ability to purchase them, or limit the ability to get ammunition for them, or all kinds of different ways, instead of looking at getting rid of the big guns that the government has. It's just employing and developing more toxic, more deadly weapons at all times. Weapons that can be used. I mean, you have nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons, actually, when we look back at history, they kind of worked in a way as a deterrent, because you had the policy of mutual assured destruction. You had two enormous armed camps with the ability to destroy themselves hundreds of times over and literally destroy the planet and the ability of humans to live on it. I mean, just make it into a wasteland with these huge hydrogen bombs with multiple warheads, and no one wanted to go there. But then the scientists started thinking, well, we can't use these things. And in fact, there was a scandal a few years back about the silos that were still used in like some of the western states with the underground silos. Had computers that were using floppy drives. I mean, do you remember the floppy drives? Great big things, really not very reliable, terrible to work with, so primitive. And these people were bored, who were running these things and minding these missiles. And you had the two guys with the two keys, and you unlock, and you got the buttons, and you got to press them both, and then it launches. This long fail-safe procedure that you have to go to before you launch the nuclear weapons. And these weapons are just horrific. And fortunately, we have not had a nuclear war. I spent much of my childhood worrying, and people my age did, not just me, but many people, worrying that there would be a nuclear war. And I grew up on reading science fiction about what would happen after a nuclear war and how horrific it would be. And now, we still have these enormous nuclear weapons, but we have the scientists and the weapons manufacturers saying, well, we can't really use these nuclear weapons. We need smaller nukes. We need tactical nukes. We need nukes that will be bunker buster type of weapons, where we could just take out, one small town instead of an entire city, or, just one area, just limited destruction. And some people are saying that these were already in use. I don't know that for sure, but in a way, tactical nukes are pretty awful. They're pretty awful, but I think that the nuclear power is even worse, because the radiation level of a nuclear facility that melts down, there's no going back from that. You have to evacuate the entire area, as we've already seen in two different areas of the world, in Ukraine and Japan, permanently. They're going to be gone. And anyway, have a happy holidays. Sorry if I bummed you out. Sleep well, friends.